Welcome to Somnus Sagas, where history comes alive through stories of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of war. Picture this. It's July 1944, and the fields of Normandy are a battleground of mud, blood, and steel. The air is thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder, and the ground trembles under the weight of an M4 Sherman tank named Hell's Bell. Inside this rolling fortress, 5 young Americans, ordinary men from Chicago, Boston, Texas, Detroit, and Alabama, face the terror of the Western Front. They're not just a crew, they're brothers, bound by the roar of the engine, the clang of shells against their armor, and the unspoken promise to bring each other home. This is their story, a saga of fire, fear, and unshakable loyalty in the heart of World War II. Join us as we ride with Hell's Bell through the chaos of battle, the quiet moments of hope, and the long shadow of war. If you're ready to dive into this epic tale, hit that subscribe button to Somnus Sagas and join our community of storytellers and history lovers. Now, let's roll into the fire. Normandy, France, July 1944. The M4 Sherman tank, Hell's Bell, growled through the muddy fields of Normandy, its tracks clawing at the earth like a wounded beast. Inside, the air was a suffocating blend of diesel fumes, gunpowder, and sweat, the summer heat turning the steel hull into a sweltering furnace. Private First Class Tommy Callahan, a 22-year-old from Chicago's South Side, sat hunched at the bow machine gun, his eyes straining through the narrow periscope that offered a fragmented view of the world outside. His hands, raw and blistered from gripping the .30 caliber machine gun's handles, trembled, not just from the tank's bone-rattling vibration, but from the ever-present fear that lurked beyond the hedgerows. Hell's Bell was part of the 2nd Armored Division, tasked with breaking through German defenses in the Bocage country during the Allied push towards St. Lo. The crew of 5 had been together since training in Fort Benning, Georgia, and later in England. Their bond forged through months of drills and the crucible of D-Day on June 6, 1944. Now, 6 weeks into the Normandy campaign, they were battle-hardened but weary, their nerves frayed by relentless ambushes, artillery barrages, and the constant threat of death. The tank's interior was a claustrophobic maze of steel, wires, and ammunition racks, with sharp edges that bruised shins and elbows. The noise was relentless. The 400 horsepower V8 engines roar, the clank of tracks, the creak of the turret. Communication relied on the intercom, but even that was often drowned out by the chaos of battle. The crew lived in a world of sweat, grease, and fear, their only respite the fleeting moments between missions when they could escape the steel beast and breathe fresh air. The crew was a microcosm of America, each man bringing his own story to the tank. Sergeant Mike Sarge Donovan, the commander, was a 29-year-old Boston Irishman with a boxer's build and a voice like gravel. A former amateur fighter, he'd enlisted after Pearl Harbor, driven by duty and a need to prove himself. His calm authority masked the weight of command. Every decision could mean life or death for his crew. Off duty, he was a father figure, sharing stories of Boston's pubs and his kid sister Mary, whose letters he kept tucked in his jacket. Corporal Eddie Ruiz, the gunner, was a wiry Texan with a quick smile and a sharpshooter's precision. Raised on a ranch near San Antonio, he'd grown up hunting and riding, skills that translated to the turret's controls. His Catholic faith was his anchor, and he'd whisper prayers to the Virgin Mary before every shot, his fingers brushing a small crucifix around his neck. Private Joe. Big Joe Kowalski, the loader, was a hulking Polish-American from Detroit, strong as an ox but gentle off the battlefield. His strength was vital in the loader's role, where he shoved 75mm shells into the breach with machine-like efficiency. Joe's Polish heritage came through in his songs and stories of his mother's pierogi, which he dreamed of cooking for the crew if they survived. Private Billy Wheels Harper, the driver, was a scrawny 19-year-old from Alabama with a knack for mechanics. He treated a Hell's Bell like a living thing, coaxing it through mud, snow, and shell fire, though he cursed its quirks with every jolt. Billy's optimism was infectious, and he carried a faded photo of his high school sweetheart, Mary, in his wallet, a talisman against the war's horrors. Private Tommy Callahan, the bow gunner and assistant driver, was the quiet one, always watching, always ready. Raised in Chicago's working-class neighborhoods, he'd enlisted to escape a dead-end job in a steel mill. The tank was his world now, and he'd learned to read the battlefield through the periscope, spotting threats before they could strike. His calm under pressure earned him the crew's respect, but he carried a private fear of never making it home. Their bond was their lifeline, a brotherhood forged in the fire of war. They were Hell's Bells beating hard, and together they faced the crucible of the Western Front. Flashback. Fort Benning, Georgia, spring 1943. The crew first met at Fort Benning, where the US Army transformed raw recruits into tankers. Tommy remembered the endless drills under Georgia's blazing sun, crawling through mud to learn the Sherman's tracks, memorizing the 75mm gun's firing sequence, and enduring lectures on German armor, Panzers, Tigers, and the dreaded 88mm guns that could punch through a Sherman's armor like paper. The instructors were relentless, their voices barking over the clatter of tank tracks. "Move faster, Callahan. You're not on a Chicago streetcar." Tommy, fresh from the city's gritty neighborhoods, gritted his teeth and pushed through, determined to prove himself. Sarge, already a sergeant, took the green recruits under his wing. His Boston accent was sharp, but his patience was evident as he guided them through the chaos of training. "You boys stick with me, and we'll make it through this war," he'd said, his eyes glinting with a mix of determination and defiance. Tommy admired Sarge's confidence, sensing a deeper drive. a need to protect, born from a life of fighting for everything he had. Sarge had grown up in Boston's tough Irish neighborhoods, where he'd learned to take a punch and give one back, a skill that made him a natural leader. Eddie stood out immediately, his sharpshooting skills earning him the gunner's role. During target practice, he'd hit every mark, grinning as the instructors nodded approvingly. Born to shoot, he'd say, his Texas drawl laced with pride. Raised on a ranch near San Antonio, Eddie had spent his childhood hunting deer and riding horses, his steady hands and keen eyes perfect for the turret's controls. He'd joke about roping panzers like cattle, but his humor hid a quiet faith, his fingers often brushing the crucifix around his neck. Joe, the gentle giant, struggled with the tank's cramped confines, but adapted quickly, his strength making him a natural loader. At 6 feet 3 inches and 220 pounds, he was a bear of a man, but his kindness shone through in his easy smile and willingness to help. If I can fit in this sardine can, I can do anything, he'd joke, his Detroit accent thick from years in the auto factories. Joe's Polish heritage was a point of pride, and he'd share stories of his mother's pierogi and his dream of opening a garage after the war. Billy, barely 18, was the youngest, a scrawny farm boy from Alabama with a knack for mechanics. He could tear apart and rebuild a Sherman's V8 engine in record time, his hands moving with the dexterity that belied his age. "This tank's just a big tractor," he'd say, wiping grease from his hands. Billy's optimism was infectious, and he'd talk endlessly about his high school sweetheart, Mary, showing her photo to anyone who'd look. The crew teased him mercilessly, but they envied his hope, his belief that the war was just a detour on the road to a happy life. Tommy, quiet and observant, found his place at the bow machine gun. Raised in Chicago's working-class neighborhoods, he'd grown up watching his father toil in the steel mills, a life he'd sworn to escape. Enlisting was his ticket out, but the reality of tank warfare was far from the adventure he'd imagined. His steady hands and sharp eyes made him a natural for the bow gunner's role, and he learned to read the battlefield through the periscope, spotting threats before they could strike. Tommy kept his fears to himself, but he felt a growing loyalty to the crew, men who'd become his family. Training wasn't just technical, it was a test of character. The recruits faced grueling obstacle courses, simulated battles, and long marches under Georgia's sun. They learned to work as a unit, each man's role critical to the tank's operation. At night, they gathered in the barracks, sharing stories over cigarettes and cheap beer. Eddie told tales of roping cattle under the Texas stars, his hands mimicking the lasso's loop. Joe spoke of his mother's pierogi and his dream of a garage filled with the hum of engines. Billy bragged about Mary, his voice softening as he described her letters, filled with promises of a future together. Sarge shared stories of boxing matches in Boston's smoky gyms, his fists clenching as he described a knockout punch. though he never mentioned the family he'd left behind. Only his sister, Mary, who sent him letters that he read and reread in private. By the time they shipped to England in early 1944, the crew was a unit, their differences moved by shared hardship. They trained on the Salisbury Plain, maneuvering the Sherman through mock battles against enemy tanks played by British crews. The English countryside was a stark contrast to Georgia's heat, with rolling hills and grey skies, but the drills were just as brutal. Sarge pushed them hard, knowing the real test was coming. "The Krauts won't give us a second chance," he'd say, his voice firm but laced with care. Tommy felt a mix of fear and pride. He was part of something bigger, a crew that would face the war together. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach. Hell's Bell landed on Omaha Beach hours after the first waves. Part of the follow-up forces tasked with breaking through German defenses. Tommy remembered the chaos as they rolled off the LCT landing craft, tank into shallow water. The tank's engine straining as Billy navigated the shingle. The roar of artillery filled the air, punctuated by the screams of wounded infantry and the crackle of machine gun fire. Burning landing craft littered the shore, their smoke mixing with the sea mist. Sarge stood in the turret, his eyes scanning through the commander's cupola, shouting orders over the intercom as shells exploded around them. "Wheels, keep her moving," Sarge yelled, his voice cutting through the engine's roar. "Eddie, target that bunker, 2 o'clock. Eddie fired a high-explosive round, the 75mm guns boom shaking the tank. The bunker erupted in a cloud of smoke, but German machine gun fire raked the beach, pinning down the infantry. Tommy fired the Boer machine gun, his bursts cutting through the haze, trying to suppress the enemy gunners. His periscope showed a hellscape. Bodies sprawled in the sand, tanks burning, men screaming for medics. The smell of blood, cordite, and burning metal seeped through the tank's vents, mingling with the diesel fumes inside. They pushed inland, dodging anti-tank mines and barbed wire. A German 88mm gun opened fire from a hidden position, its high-velocity shells screaming past. Another Sherman in their platoon took a direct hit, its turret blown off in a fireball, the ammunition cooking off in a series of explosions that echoed across the beach. Tommy's heart pounded, the reality of the Ronson nickname sinking in. The Sherman's gasoline engine and thin armor, 50mm sides, 76mm front, made it prone to catastrophic fires. Every crewman knew the odds. A hit to the ammo rack meant instant death, or worse, burning alive, trapped in a steel coffin. By nightfall, Hell's Bell reached the edge of the beachhead, its crew exhausted but alive. They parked in a hedgerow, camouflaging the tank with branches to hide from German spotter planes. Tommy climbed out, his legs shaking, and vomited into the grass. The images of the beach, bodies, blood, and burning tanks seared into his mind. Sarge clapped a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but kind. "You did good, kid," he said, his voice softer than usual. "We all did." It was their baptism of fire, and it bound them tighter than ever, a brotherhood forged in the chaos of D-Day. July 20th, 1944, near Saint-Lô. 6 weeks later, the crew was deep in the Bocage, fighting to clear the path to Saint-Lô. The hedgerows, dense earthen walls topped with trees, were a tanker's nightmare, hiding German infantry with Panzerfausts and anti-tank guns. The Bocage's narrow lanes forced tanks into predictable paths, perfect for ambushes. The radio crackled with a warning from the lead tank in their platoon. "Enemy sighted. Panzer IVs, 2 o'clock, 800 yards." Tommy's stomach lurched, his hands tightening on the machine gun's handles. The Germans had set an ambush, their tanks camouflaged among the debris of a ruined French village, their guns trained on the choke points. Sarge's voice snapped over the intercom. "Wheels, hard right. Eddie, target the lead panzer. Joe, AP round. Now." Billy yanked the steering levers, Hell's Bell swerving as its track slipped in the Normandy mud. Tommy scanned the periscope, his pulse racing, searching for infantry with Panzerfausts. The handheld rockets could pierce the Sherman's 50mm side armor and ignite the ammo rack, turning the tank into a fireball. The Ronson nickname haunted every crewman's thoughts, a grim reminder of their vulnerability. Boom! The 75mm gun roared, the recoil shaking the tank like an earthquake. Tommy felt the shockwave through the steel floor, his teeth rattling. "Missed," Eddie cursed, his voice tight with frustration. "Joe, reload, faster." Joe slammed another armor-piercing round into the breech, his arms moving like pistons despite the cramped turret. Sarge shouted coordinates, his voice rising with urgency. 600 yards, a just left 2 degrees. A deafening clang rocked the tank as a German shell glanced off the turret, leaving a white-hot scar on the armor. Tommy flinched, his ears ringing, his mind racing with the thought of a direct hit. The Sherman's 76mm frontal armor was decent, but a Panzer IV's 75mm gun could penetrate it at close range, and a hit to the ammo rack would mean instant death. "Keep it together, boys," Sarge yelled, his voice a lifeline in the chaos. Eddie adjusted the sights and fired again, the shell striking the Panzer IV's turret. Through his periscope, Tommy saw it erupt in flames, its crew bailing out in panic, scrambling for cover as he raked the area with machine gun fire. The crew let out a ragged cheer, but the relief was fleeting. "Infantry!" Tommy shouted, spotting movement in the hedgerow. 3 o'clock, 200 yards. He squeezed the bow machine gun's trigger, sending a stream of .30 caliber rounds into the bushes, hoping to pin down the German soldiers before they could fire their Panzerfausts. Another boom. A second Panzer fired, the shell screaming past and exploding in a field behind them. Dirt and shrapnel clattered against Hell's Bell's hull like hail, the sound echoing inside the tank. "Wheels, get us behind that barn," Sarge ordered, pointing to a half-destroyed structure that offered a sliver of cover. Billy gunned the engine, the tank lurching forward, its tracks chewing through the mud. But before they could reach the barn, a third Panzer emerged from the smoke, its long-barreled gun swinging toward them like the finger of death. "Reverse, wheels now!" Sarge screamed. Billy threw the tank into reverse, the engine screaming as the tracks churned backward, slipping in the mud. Tommy kept firing, his hands burning from the machine gun's heat, his eyes darting between the periscope and the shadows in the trees. The Panzer fired, and the world exploded. The shell struck Hell's Bell's front glacis plate, the impact like a sledgehammer to the chest. Tommy's head slammed against the periscope, stars bursting in his vision. He braced for the fireball, the screams, the end. But the armor held, just barely, the 76mm plate dented but intact. "Fire, Eddie, fire!" Sarge roared. Eddie adjusted his aim, his hand steady despite the chaos, and fired. The shell hit the Panzer's turret ring, disabling its gun. Tommy raked the area with machine gun fire as the German crew bailed out, their silhouettes darting through the smoke. "Wheels, get us out," Sarge ordered. Billy maneuvered through the village's ruins, dodging debris and praying the engine wouldn't stall. The radio crackled with reports of more German tanks closing in, and Sarge made the call to retreat to an Allied-held ridge a mile back. As Hell's Bell reached the safety of the ridge, the crew was silent, each man grappling with the fact that they'd survived another brush with death. Tommy's heart pounded, the clang of the shell echoing in his mind. He looked at his trembling hands, raw and blistered from the machine gun, and wondered how many more times they could cheat fate. Sarge's voice broke the silence over the intercom. "Good work, boys. We're still here." It was a small victory, but in the bocage, every day alive was a triumph. Between battles, life in Hell's Bell was a relentless grind. The crew parked the tank in wooded areas, hiding under camouflage netting to avoid German spotter planes like the Fieseler Storch, whose slow buzz was a harbinger of artillery or Luftwaffe strikes. They climbed out, their bodies aching from hours in the cramped confines, their uniforms soaked with sweat and streaked with grease. Tommy stretched, wincing as his joints protested, the constant jarring of the tank leaving his muscles sore. The air outside was cool, a stark contrast to the tank's stifling heat, but the smell of cordite and oil clung to his clothes, a constant reminder of the battlefield. His hands were blistered, his ears rang from the gun's roar, and his mouth tasted of dust and fear. Maintenance was a constant battle, as critical as any firefight. The Sherman's tracks needed greasing to prevent them from seizing. The V8 engine required tuning to keep it running, and the 75mm gun barrel had to be cleaned to prevent fouling that could jam the breech. Tommy, as assistant driver, worked alongside Billy, crawling under the tank to check the suspension or tighten bolts. their hands black with grease. "This beast drinks more oil than a Chicago factory," Billy grumbled, wiping his hands on a rag that was more oil than cloth. A single day's neglect could mean a breakdown in combat, and a stalled tank was a sitting duck, vulnerable to Panzerfaust's anti-tank guns or the dreaded 88mm flak guns. The crew spent hours replacing worn track pins, cleaning air filters clogged with Normandy mud, and checking the ammo racks to ensure the shells were secure. A loose round could spell disaster in a fire. Meals were a grim affair. K-rations, canned meat, crackers, and a chocolate bar, if they were lucky, were the staple. Washed down with bitter coffee and heated over a small Coleman stove. The crew scavenged what they could, trading cigarettes or candy for eggs or bread from French farmers. Once, a grateful villager gave them a bottle of Calvados, Normandy's apple brandy, which they shared under the stars. The burn of the liquor, a rare comfort that warmed their throats and loosened their tongues. They ate sitting on the ground beside the tank, their mess kits balanced on their knees, swapping stories to keep their spirits up. Eddie spoke of his family's ranch near San Antonio, where he'd ridden horses under the Texas stars, dreaming of returning to wide open spaces free of hedgerows and death. Joe sang Polish folk songs, his deep voice echoing through the trees, and shared stories of his mother's pierogi, promising to cook them for the crew if they survived. Billy bragged about his sweetheart, Mary, showing her creased photo, his Alabama accent thick with longing as he read her latest letter aloud. She says she's planting a garden for when I get back. Says it'll have roses just for me. Sarge shared tales of Boston's pubs, where he'd boxed and drunk with friends, though his stories often trailed off, his eyes distant as he thought of his sister Mary, waiting at home with letters full of hope and worry. Sleep was a luxury, stolen in fleeting moments. The crew often slept inside the tank, curled on the steel floor or slumped in their seats, the hard surfaces offering no comfort. The constant threat of German counterattacks meant they rarely got more than a few hours at a time. When possible, they spread tarps beside the tank and slept under the stars, the distant rumble of artillery a grim lullaby that kept them on edge. Tommy lay awake, staring at the sky, thinking of Chicago streets, his mother's Sunday roasts, and his younger brother Jimmy, who'd wanted to enlist but was too young at 16. He wondered if he'd ever see them again, or if Hell's Bell would become his tomb, its steel walls his final resting place. The crew's bond was their salvation, a light in the darkness of war. They teased each other mercilessly. Billy's drawl, Joe's snoring that shook the tank, Eddie's prayers that he muttered before every shot. But it was all love. They shared cigarettes, passed around looted French wine, and played cards on an ammo crate, betting with pebbles or promises of future favors. Once, Joe won a week's worth of Billy's chocolate rations, only to share them back, laughing as Billy cursed him good-naturedly. Sarge was their rock, his calm authority a beacon in the chaos. But Tommy saw the toll command took. Sarge's hands shook when he lit a cigarette, and he'd sit alone at night, staring at the ground, his thoughts heavy with the weight of their lives. Once, Tommy overheard him mutter, "I can't lose you boys." And it struck him how much Sarge carried, the responsibility for their survival, the guilt of every close call, the fear that he'd failed them. Late July 1944. The push to St. Lo was a meat grinder, a brutal campaign that tested the crew's endurance and resolve. The Germans had fortified every hedgerow and village with anti-tank guns, machine gun nests, and Panzerfaust armed infantry, turning the Bocage into a deadly maze. Hell's Bell fought in dozens of engagements, from small skirmishes to massive tank battles that left the fields littered with burning wrecks. Tommy learned to live with the fear, the claustrophobia, and the knowledge that every mission could be their last. He saw other tanks in their platoon brew up, their crews screaming as flames engulfed them, the ammunition cooking off in a series of explosions that lit up the night. The sight haunted his dreams, and he'd wake at night, heart racing, hearing those screams, the smell of burning metal lingering in his nostrils like a ghost. On July 25th, Hell's Bell supported an infantry advance near a crossroads outside St. Lo, a key objective in the Allied breakout. The Germans had fortified the area with a Tiger I tank, its 88mm gun a death sentence for any Sherman. Sarge positioned the tank behind a low stone wall, using it as cover while Eddie scanned for targets through the gunner's sight. "Tiger at 10 o'clock, Sarge shouted, spotting the massive tank through the smoke, its angular silhouette a menacing shadow in the haze. The Tiger's 100mm frontal armor was nearly impervious to the Sherman's 75mm gun, and its 88mm could pierce Hell's Bell from over a mile away, turning their steel home into a fiery grave. "Joe, a P round," Sarge ordered, his voice steady but urgent. Joe loaded the shell, his hands shaking from adrenaline, the 20-pound round slamming into the breech with a metallic thunk. Eddie fired, but the shot bounced off the Tiger's armor, leaving only a dent. "No good," Eddie yelled, his voice tight with frustration, his fingers brushing his crucifix as he whispered a prayer. The Tiger's turret swung toward them, its gun a dark promise of death. "Wheels, move," Sarge screamed. Billy threw the tank into gear, but the mud slowed them, the tracks slipping in the churned-up earth. Tommy fired the Burr machine gun at German infantry closing in, his heart pounding as he saw a soldier raise a Panzerfaust, its rocket capable of turning Hell's Bell into a fireball with a single hit. The Tiger fired, and the shell struck the ground just short of Hell's Bell, showering the tank with dirt and rock. The concussion rattled Tommy's teeth, his ears ringing, but they were alive. "Fire again," Sarge ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. Eddie adjusted his aim, targeting the Tiger's weaker side armor as it turned to engage another Sherman in their platoon. The shot hit, and the Tiger erupted in flames, its crew bailing out in panic, their silhouettes darting through the smoke as Tommy raked the area with machine gun fire to keep them down. The crew let out a ragged cheer, but the victory was bittersweet. Another tank in their platoon took a direct hit, its turret blown off in a fireball that lit up the battlefield. Tommy saw the crew's blackened figures stumble out, only to be cut down by German machine gun fire, their screams echoing in his ears long after the battle ended. By the time Saint-Lô fell on July 25th, Hell's Bell was battered but operational, its hull scarred with dents and burns, its paint chipped from shrapnel and near misses. The crew mourned the loss of friends, other tankers who hadn't made it, men they trained with, laughed with, shared cigarettes with, and buried their grief in the routine of maintenance and preparation for the next fight. That night, they sat around a fire in a wooded area, passing around a flask of Calvados scavenged from a French cellar. Sarge raised it in a toast, his voice heavy. To the boys we lost, and the ones still standing. The crew drank in silence, the weight of the war pressing down on them, the flames casting shadows on their weary faces. August 1944, liberated village near Falaises. The Allies broke out of Normandy with Operation Cobra. Hell's Bell rolled through liberated French villages, where civilians emerged from cellars and shattered homes to cheer their arrival. In one village near Falaise, the crew stopped to repair a thrown track, their hands numb from the work, their tools slipping in the greasy mud. A group of villagers approached, led by an elderly woman with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. She carried a basket of apples and a bottle of homemade wine, offering them with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Merci," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "You've given us our home back." Tommy, who spoke a little French from his high school days, translated for the crew, his voice catching as he saw the woman's emotion. They shared the apples, their first fresh food in weeks, the crisp sweetness a stark contrast to the bland K-rations. They passed the wine around, the tart liquid warming their throats and loosening their tongues. Joe, ever the gentle giant, knelt to give a young girl a chocolate bar from his rations, her smile lighting up the grim day like a ray of sunshine. Billy, always the charmer, tried to flirt with a French girl, his Alabama accent drawing laughs from the villagers as he stumbled over French phrases Tommy taught him. Eddie, with a talent he rarely showed, sketched a quick portrait of the elderly woman on a scrap of paper, his pencil capturing her weathered features with surprising tenderness. He handed it to her, earning a hug that left him blushing, his usual bravado replaced by a shy smile. Sarge watched it all, a rare smile on his face, though his eyes remained guarded, as if he couldn't fully let go of the war's weight. These moments were fleeting, but they reminded the crew of what they were fighting for. A world where people could live free, where children could smile, where old women could offer apples without fear. The villagers' gratitude was a balm for their battered souls, a reminder that the war wasn't just about survival, but about freeing people from tyranny. As they climbed back into Hell's Bell, their hands still sticky with apple juice, Tommy felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were making a difference. Sarge clapped him on the back as they sealed the hatches. "Keep that in your heart, kid," he said. "It's what keeps us going." The tank rumbled to life, and they rolled on, carrying the memory of the village with them. As summer turned to fall, Hell's Bell pushed deeper into France, then Belgium. As part of the Allied advance toward Germany, the battles grew fiercer as the Germans fought to hold every inch of ground, their defenses stiffened by desperation. The crew faced new threats. Panther tanks, with their sloped armor and deadly 75mm guns that could pierce a Sherman's armor with ease. 88mm flak guns, repurposed as anti-tank weapons that could destroy a tank from over a mile away, and mines that could tear a track off or rip a hull apart. Tommy's fear never faded, but he channeled it into his role. His machine gun burst saving Hell's Bell from infantry attacks time and again. He became adept at spotting threats through the periscope, his eyes sharp despite the strain of constant vigilance, his hands steady even as his heart raced. Life outside combat was a relentless grind. The crew scavenged what they could: wine from abandoned cellars, bread from grateful villagers. But supplies were always short, and hunger was a constant companion. Winter brought new challenges, freezing temperatures that made the tank's steel hull almost unbearable to touch, the cold seeping through their uniforms and into their bones. Snow bogged down Hell's Bell's tracks, forcing Billy and Tommy to dig them out with shovels, their fingers numb and their breath visible in the frigid air. Frostbite was a constant threat, and Tommy's fingers ached as he worked on the tracks, his gloves worn thin from months of use. The crew wrapped themselves in blankets, sleeping near the engine for warmth, the low hum a faint comfort in the icy nights. The crew's bond deepened with each battle, a lifeline in the darkness. Eddie taught Tommy Spanish curses, laughing as Tommy mangled the pronunciation, his Chicago accent clashing with the Texan's drawl. Joe shared his mother's pierogi recipe, describing the dough and filling with a wistful smile, promising to cook it for the crew if they survived. Billy's letters to Mary grew heavier, filled with longing and doubt, though he still read them aloud for the crew's amusement, his voice softening as he spoke of her garden and their dreams of a home together. Sarge's stories of Boston grew rare, his eyes haunted by the losses they'd seen. Other tanks, other crews, friends reduced to ash and memory. In November, near Aachen, Hell's Bell took a hit from an 88mm gun during a push to secure the city, the first German city to fall to the Allies. The shell dented the hull but didn't penetrate. A stroke of luck that left the crew shaken but alive. They repaired the damage under shell fire, their hands numb, their hearts racing, the fear of a second hit ever present. Tommy and Billy worked side by side, tightening bolts and patching the track, their breaths steaming in the cold. "We're gonna make it, Tommy," Billy said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. Tommy nodded, wanting to believe it, but the war had taught him to take nothing for granted. In December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge erupted, a massive German counter-offensive through the Ardennes that caught the Allies off guard. Hell's Bell was thrown into the chaos, fighting in blinding snowstorms and sub-zero temperatures that tested their endurance. On December 20th, they held a crossroads against a German Panzer Grenadier unit supported by a King Tiger tank. Its 88mm gun, a nightmare for any Sherman. Sarge used the terrain, hiding Hell's Bell in a defilade behind a ridge, the snow providing some cover. Eddie waited for the perfect shot, his hand steady despite the cold, his crucifix glinting in the dim light of the turret. Tommy kept the infantry at bay, his machine gun chattering as German soldiers tried to flank them with Panzerfausts, their figures ghostly in the snow. The King Tiger fired, the shell missing by inches, blasting a crater in the frozen ground. Eddie returned fire, aiming for the tank's rear armor, the only weak point on the massive beast. The shot hit, and the King Tiger burned, its crew bailing out into the snow. But the victory came at a cost. Another Sherman in their platoon was destroyed. Its crew burned alive in a fireball that lit up the night. Tommy saw the flames through his periscope, the screams echoing in his ears, and he fired until his machine gun ran dry, his hands shaking as he reloaded. That night, the crew huddled around a fire in a wooded area, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Hell's Bell had taken a beating, its tracks damaged by a mine, but Billy and Tommy had repaired it under fire, their fingers numb from the cold. Sarge passed around a flask of looted French brandy, a rare treat scavenged from a ruined farmhouse. "To us," he said, raising the flask, his voice thick with emotion. "To the boys who keep this damn war machine rolling." The crew drank, their laughter mingling with the crackle of the fire, a fleeting moment of warmth in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. Tommy looked at his crewmates, Eddie, Joe, Billy, and Sarge, and felt a fierce loyalty. They were his brothers, bound by the fire and steel of Hell's Bell, and he'd do anything to keep them alive. By March 1945, Hell's Bell crossed the Rhine into Germany, part of the final push to end the war. The end was in sight, but the fighting was no less brutal. The Germans, desperate and cornered, threw everything they had at the Allies. King Tiger tanks, fanatical SS units, and young conscripts barely trained to fight. Tommy saw entire towns reduced to rubble, civilians fleeing with what little they could carry, their eyes hollow with fear. He saw German soldiers, some no older than Billy, fighting to the last, their faces gaunt with hunger and defeat. In early April, near the Ruhr pocket, Hell's Bell faced a Panther tank in a deadly duel. The Panther's 75mm gun could pierce a Sherman's armor with ease, and the crew knew it. Sarge positioned the tank in a defilade, using a hill for cover, while Eddie waited for the perfect shot, his eyes locked on the gunner's sight. Tommy kept the infantry at bay, his machine gun chattering as German soldiers tried to flank them with Panzerfausts, their figures darting through the rubble. The Panther fired, the shell missing by inches, blasting a crater in the ground that showered Hell's Bell with dirt. Eddie returned fire, hitting the Panther's turret ring, and it burned, its crew bailing out into a hail of Tommy's machine gun fire. But the cost was high. Another Sherman in their platoon was destroyed, its crew lost in a fireball that lit up the night, the screams echoing in Tommy's ears long after the battle ended. The crew fought on, their bodies and minds pushed to the limit. Tommy's hands shook more often now, the tremors a constant reminder of the shells that had nearly ended them. He woke at night, heart racing, hearing the clang of shells against the tank, the screams of burning crews. Eddie's prayers grew quieter, whispered under his breath as if he feared God might not hear over the war's roar. Joe's songs were rare, his laughter replaced by a weary silence, his eyes distant as he thought of home. Billy's letters to Mary were heavy with doubt, his dreams of a garden and a home together tinged with fear that he'd never make it back. Sarge's voice never wavered, but his eyes told a story of loss, of friends buried in the fields of Normandy, the snows of the Ardennes, and now the rubble of Germany. When the war in Europe ended on May 8th, 1945, Hell's Bell was still rolling, its hull scarred with dents and burns, its paint chipped from countless near misses. The crew stood together in a German village, watching as German soldiers surrendered in droves, their faces gaunt with defeat, their rifles stacked in piles. The crew's own faces were a mix of relief and exhaustion, their eyes hollow from the weight of what they'd seen. They were alive against all odds, but the war had changed them forever. Sarge clapped each man on the shoulder, his voice steady but thick. "We made it, boys. We made it." Tommy felt a lump in his throat, the weight of their survival sinking in, mingled with the grief for those who hadn't made it. Friends, brothers, tankers lost to the fire. Tommy returned to Chicago in late 1945, stepping off the train into a city that felt alien. The bustle of the streets, the laughter of civilians, the clatter of streetcars. It was all wrong, too loud, too normal. He carried the war with him, the roar of Hell's Bell's gun, the clang of shells against its hull, the screams of burning tanks, the faces of his crew. He'd wake at night, heart racing, reaching for a machine gun that wasn't there. the smell of diesel and cordite lingering in his nostrils. The Chicago wind carried echoes of artillery, and the clatter of factory machinery sounded too much like the tank's tracks. He found work in a steel mill, the same kind he'd sworn to escape, but it was steady, and he needed the routine to anchor him. Some nights, he'd sit in a bar, nursing a beer, staring at the wall as memories of Hell's Bell played in his mind. He'd see Sarge's steady hand on the turret, Eddie's crucifix glinting in the dim light, Joe's grin as he sang, Billy's photo of Mary creased from months in his wallet. They were his brothers, bound by the fire and steel of a Sherman tank, and no amount of time could break that bond. Tommy kept in touch with the crew, writing letters to Eddie, Joe, and Billy, and visiting Sarge in Boston once. Eddie had returned to his family's ranch in Texas, but his letters spoke of sleepless nights and a restlessness he couldn't shake. The wide open plains no longer enough to quiet his mind. Joe opened a garage in Detroit, fulfilling his dream, but his laughter was quieter now, his songs reserved for his family, his hands still bearing the calluses of loading shells. Billy married Mary, his high school sweetheart, and they settled in Alabama, but his letters hinted at struggles to adjust to civilian life, the war's shadow lingering in his dreams. Sarge went back to Boston, working as a mechanic, but Tommy saw the weight in his eyes during their visit, a commander's guilt for the men he'd lost, even if he'd saved his own crew. They shared a beer in a smoky pub, and Sarge raised his glass, his voice low, to the boys we brought home, and the ones we didn't. Tommy nodded, the weight of those words settling in his chest. In 1950, 5 years after the war, the crew reunited in Chicago for a weekend, a rare chance to reconnect. Tommy hosted them at a small diner near his apartment, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the clink of glasses. They were older now, their faces lined with the years, their hair touched with grey. Sarge most of all, his boxer's frame still strong, but his eyes carrying a weariness that hadn't been there in 1943. Eddie was quieter, his Texas grin tempered by the years. Joe's laugh was softer, but his handshake was as strong as ever. Billy, now a husband and father, brought a photo of Mary and their newborn son, his pride shining through the war's shadow. Tommy felt a warmth in his chest, seeing them together again, the bond unchanged despite the years. They shared stories, not of the war, but of life after. Eddie's ranch, Joe's garage, Billy's family, Sarge's new job coaching young boxers. The war lingered in the silences, in the way their eyes met, knowing what they'd shared. Sarge raised a glass of whiskey, his hand steady for the first time Tommy could remember. "To Hell's Bell," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And to the boys who made her more than steel." They drank, their laughter mingling with the ghosts of the past, a final toast to the tank that had carried them through the fire, to the brothers who'd fought and bled together, and to the world they'd fought to save. And so, the story of Hell's Bell and her crew comes to a close. A tale of courage, brotherhood, and the enduring scars of war. Tommy, Sarge, Eddie, Joe, and Billy face the fire of the Western Front, their lives intertwined with the steel heart of a Sherman tank. They carried the weight of their battles, but also the strength of their bond, a light that guided them through the darkest days. Here at Somnus Sagas, we're honored to share their story with you, to bring history to life through the voices of those who lived it. If this journey moved you, please hit that subscribe button to join our community of storytellers and history lovers. Your support keeps these sagas alive, and there's so much more to explore together. Until next time, rest easy, and may the echoes of the past inspire you to carry